Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to those of you who are here joining us in person, as well as those who are joining by Zoom. So for those of you who are joining by Zoom, if you could please introduce yourself in the chat by sharing your name, your pronouns. Oh, that's my laptop. Just close it. Thank you. Please share your name, your pronouns, if you feel comfortable sharing those, as well as the organization that you are with. So my name is Dr. Rochelle Espiritu. I'm so pleased to be your moderator for today's session. I identify as a Filipina immigrant. I have been in the States since I was a toddler. And I am also a managing partner at Change Matrix, which is a small minority-owned, women-owned business that does work around systems change for equity. I'm also really passionate about doing community work. And so when the organizers asked me to help moderate, of course I said yes. I am passionate about the AAPI community and wanting to make sure that we are all on the road to well-being. So today we're going to be honoring AAPI victims of anti-Asian hate and speaking about events that may be somewhat re-traumatizing. We know that the topics shared today are important, but they're also heartbreaking. And like many of you, I remember where I was on the day of the Atlanta tragedy. And I know that we come into this space with a lot of different emotions. So we do want you to take care of yourselves. If you do have to take a break, leave the room for a glass of water or turn off your screen, please feel free to do that. So as we gather, I want to acknowledge the University of Colorado Anschutz campus is on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho Nation. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. So on March 16th, 8 people were killed in the mass shootings in spas in Atlanta, which included Daoyou Feng, who was described to be outgoing and independent by her family. Hyun Jung Grant, a mother of 2, described by her family as someone who enjoyed Korean dancing. Suncha Kim, a Korean immigrant whose family described her as her proudest moment was becoming an American citizen. Paul Andre Michels, described to be a very good-hearted handyman. Chung Park, who was 74, with 5 children who loved sunflowers and ceramic owls. Xiaojie Tan, who was looking forward to celebrating her 50th birthday that year with her daughter. Delaina Ashley Yaun, a mother to a 14-year-old son and an 8-month-old daughter. And Yong Ae Yue, who loved taking her dog with her to work. Since the start of the pandemic, Asian Americans and Asians have experienced a sharp trend and increase in discrimination and in violence. In Colorado alone, during those same years of 2020 and 2021, there were 119 incidents that were reported to the National Stop AAPI Hate reporting platform, with the majority of those incidents being verbal attacks. And nationally, anti-Asian hate has spiked 393% between 2020 and 2021. I want to ask you to please join us in a moment of silence as we remember all the victims of Asian hate and gun violence. So the purpose of today's panel is to honor those who died on March 18th and also all the victims of AAPI hate and gun violence. So we want to reflect a little bit today on what we can do both for inward care as well as outward care. So for the inward care, we are going to talk a little bit about self-care and taking care of our mental health and well-being, how to recognize when you or others have been a victim of crime and what to do about that. We also want to share some tools and resources addressing victimization, including how to report incidents. For our outward care, we want to talk a little bit about community building and how we can work with others to heal our wounds and to move forward and build resilience. And lastly, we're going to come together as a community to discuss where we can go from here. So before we begin the panel discussion, just want to take a moment to say thank you to those individuals and organizations who helped make today's event possible. So first, we want to thank you to Dr. Emmy Betts, who not only is a panelist, but also helped to coordinate today's venue. Thank you very much, at the Colorado School of Public Health. And thank you also for the treats for this morning. We want to thank your team at the university for helping with the logistics and the tech today. Second, we'd like to thank the steering committee, which includes members from the Asian Pacific Development Center, the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Colorado, and the Colorado Asian Culture and Education Network. Thank you. And specifically, we want to make sure we're thanking Michelle Yee, who really had a vision for this event and provided a lot of leadership for that. The other supporting organizations include the Asian Chamber of Commerce, the Asian Girls Ignite, Asian Real Estate Association of America, Greater Denver, Colorado Asian Pacific United, Community Organizing for Radical Empathy, Denver Immigrant and Refugee Commission, Japanese Arts Network, and the Sakura Foundation. Thank you to all of you. All right, so now I'd like to welcome up today's panelists, and I'm going to call you in order that I'd like you to sit, if you don't mind. So we'll have Dr. Emmy Betts, the Director of Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative, join us here, and Harry Siddhartha, Executive Director of Asian Pacific Development Center. And then we have Brian Sugioka, Chief Deputy District Attorney of the 18th Judicial District. Then we have Dr. DJ Ida, Executive Director of the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. And Maisha Fields, Director of Community Partnerships, Salud Family Health Centers, will be joining us shortly. So I'm going to move to my spot for moderating, and we'll begin. Okay, so we're going to start off with you, Dr. Betts. Or no, sorry, Harry. All right, so Harry, from speaking with many, we can place ourselves on March 16th when we learned what was happening in Atlanta. But I actually want to ask you about March 17th. So can you tell me a little bit about what you remember from that day as you interacted with community members and what the community has been doing since that day?
Sure, thank you, Rochelle. And I remember March 17 as a day. A lot of us were still in shock and still in grief over what happened. Fortunately, there was already a coalition in place running to hate crimes because and that coalition is still going. But I remember mostly on that day was just a lot of meetings, a lot of logistical planning, but also a lot of, talking.
Sharing that, Harry. I want to move over to Dr. Betts to help give a little bit of that national context of gun violence. And so could you tell us a little bit about how you see March 16th of gun violence in our community?
bring a perspective of a larger about firearm involved injury. Frighten all of us in many, lots of ways to think about whether firearm deaths in the United States.
Hold your mic up
Oh,
just
sorry,
a
am I
little
cutting out?
closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're having a hard time with the sound.
Is that better? Is.
Here, I can also pass this over
Okay.
to people as well. See. Hold on, you know, I'm going to give this to you.
Okay, better, hopefully. So, so when we think about firearm and firearm-related deaths, like I said, only about 1% are from mass shootings. In fact, at least half are from suicide, and that's true in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community as well. So in 2020, there were 670 Asian Americans living in the United States who died from a firearm, and 58% of those were suicide. I don't say any of that to minimize the horror of that day and those innocent victims, but I think that context can be helpful as we think about how to prevent violence generally in our communities, and that it takes different kinds of solutions for different kinds of problems. I think the last thing I'll just mention as we're starting this conversation is in the importance of acknowledging how many of those victims in Atlanta were women, and the intersection between domestic violence, sexual violence, gun violence, and hate crimes as well, and recognizing that women often, including in the Asian American community, bear the brunt. And we really have to address those equity issues.
Thank you, Dr. Betts. We're going to move over to Brian, who will give us a little bit more of the context around hate crimes. So Brian, if you could share with us how hate crimes are defined in the state of Colorado and what you should do if you think you are a victim of a hate crime.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So Colorado really has two categories or types of what we call bias motivated crimes. That's actually the language in the statute. And it essentially enhances penalties. In other words, many of these behaviors are already criminal in nature, but if they are done in a way that is directed against a protected group, then the penalties for those offenses are higher. So essentially the statute says that if someone causes bodily injury to another, or causes property damage to another, or threatens one of those two things, and does so because of that person's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, physical or mental disability, or sexual orientation, those are the protected groups, then the penalties for that behavior are enhanced. In some instances, what would otherwise be a misdemeanor becomes a felony. There's another category, what we call bias motivated harassment, which again, there's a statute in Colorado that already criminalizes harassment, and bias motivated harassment becomes a higher level of offense. And harassment takes any number of forms, but it can include stalking type behaviors, unwanted following of a person, unwanted communications with a person, as well as unwanted physical contact of some kinds. So that's essentially what the bias motivated crimes protect against. In terms of what you should do is if you think you are a victim, we don't want you to be the lawyer. We don't want you to have to do the analysis and say, well, does this fit the statute or not? If you believe you have been the victim of a crime, if you are uncomfortable, call the police. Even if ultimately the determination is made that that behavior is not criminal, that doesn't mean law enforcement can't do anything. It may be that law enforcement could communicate with that person and indicate, hey, look, you made this other person feel very uncomfortable. You need to understand the consequences of that behavior. But certainly if something is found to be criminal, that is bias motivated offenses are a top priority for my office. I work for the 18th Judicial District Attorney, which is Arapahoe, Douglas, Elbert, and Lincoln counties. And elected District Attorney Mr. Kellner has made it very clear that this is a priority. We have a hate crimes team in our office that is explicitly dedicated to handling these sorts of offenses. So one thing I would want everyone to know is to rest assured that we will treat your case with great care. This is not something that we would ever minimize or not take seriously.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing more information about that. Dr. Ida, the next question goes to you around recognizing the impact that these kinds of crimes have in our community. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how collective trauma, like the one unleashed by the events on March 16th, impact a community. What are some of the resources that are available for individuals in the AAPI community?
Thank you, Rochelle. Actually, I remember very, very clearly that on March 16th, when you called and you asked a very, very simple question, you just asked, how are you? And you and I had been working around the country, talking to communities, AAPIs, talking about the impact, the mental health impact of racism, and also just with COVID-19. And as soon as you asked me that question, I just realized I was flooded with emotions. I was sad, I was angry, I was depressed, and I was fearful. And those were emotions that I realized that these were all the things that we've been hearing from the communities across the country. They were things that I'd held in because it's very, very difficult. And one of the things that where hate crimes affect at the individual and the community level is that it does no good to say which crime is worse or better than the others. All crimes are bad. But there's a particular insidiousness about hate crimes because with crimes, as often you can say, well, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The problem with hate crimes is you're perceived to be the wrong person all the time. There is no safe place for you to be. It no longer makes it safe for you to go in a subway, to go into the grocery store, to walk down the streets, to go into a spa or beauty parlor. And that's the problem with hate crimes. And then we look at the sort of the community level. One of the things about healing is having discussions like we're having today. It's to raise awareness around that. Many of our communities, it makes it even more. Language barriers. There could be a lot of cultural issues. We're not supposed to be, for Asian Americans in particular, we aren't supposed to be creating a cultural standpoint. You just sort of hold everything in. So very, very briefly, and we can talk about this later, but just to get to your last part about the healing. And the first thing to do about being able to heal is to acknowledge that when hate crimes do exist, they are real. Your emotional impact is very, very real, and do not minimize that. That doesn't mean that you can't do self-care. And self-care is also something that could be simple as going about it later, but there's some things that an APIMA organization is doing. But I think I just want to sort of briefly address why addressing hate crimes specifically, regular quote unquote, and I do put them other crimes, because it has a particular, I think, level of impact on the community.
So much for sharing, Dr. Ida. And welcome to Maisha Fields. Thank you. I know it took a little bit for you to get here, and we really appreciate your persistence. Maisha is the Director of Community Partnerships with the Salud Family Health Centers. And Maisha, we know that gun violence has really impacted your family personally, with your brother and his fiance being murdered in 2005. Since then, you and your mother, State Senator Rhonda Fields, have been very active in the community, trying to prevent what happened to your family from happening to others. What role did community building have in your life in the years following his death? And what advice would you give to the AAPI community and allies to honor those who have been lost to AAPI hate?
Thank you so much, Rochelle. And thank you everyone for being here and taking a moment out of your day to honor with action. You know, one thing that my mom and Christine Wolf was the mother of Vivian Wolf. She's Korean. I remember the first day that she had an opportunity to testify in the 18th Judicial District. The dead people can't talk. And there will never be a time that my daughter will be able to tell her story. I'm greatly appreciative of each and every one of you being here today. It's okay to talk about the lost. It's okay to show up for those who can't show up for themselves anymore. And it's okay to speak truth to our powerful individuals who are responsible and should be accountable for making sure that our sacred spaces are sacred, our churches, our schools, a spa, movie theater, a grocery store. We have lost far too many. And I came to this work not by choice. There wasn't a commercial that came online that said, come and join us. I'm a part of a club that no one should ever have to be a part of. I'm not talking about Costco or, Sam's Club was way, way back in the day. But a club in which you're invited to due to death at the hands of a gun. Something that's completely preventable. So the way that I came into this work is, yes, my brother and his fiance were murdered 15 days after he graduated from college at Colorado State University. And less than a week before he was set to testify in relation to him being a witness to a mass shooting. At that mass shooting, he was shot in his leg. 7 other people were shot, and a young man by the name of Gregory Van was shot as well. The way that community has really given me hope, and I think it gives us, each and every one of us, hope, is that other people come to you. They come to you in subtleties, like, I'm here with you, I stand with you, I'm praying for you, sending flowers, sending words of encouragement. But I think the most important thing is that they were with me, the community, our family, through the healing process of obtaining justice. Very difficult thing to do as a survivor of gun violence. Dealing with all your other emotions of redefining normal. But it was the community when we said that we are going to fight to find the people who murdered my brother. They stood with us. They walked with us. They championed with us. They helped raise money for a Crime Stopper Award. They showed up in court when it was time for us to testify. We had to see horrific events that took place before Javad's death. They showed up at the Capitol to make sure that the laws that we wanted to pass, to make sure that witnesses were more protected. Gave hugs, they gave encouragement, and why this day is so important, and what you all are doing to make sure that people do not forget and that they honor with action, because no one should live in fear of gun violence. And no one should live in fear that because the color of their skin or how they show up in the world, we all have different things that make us look different. Black community, we have broader noses, right? And so no one should discriminate against me because of the way I look or the way that I speak or the color of my skin, because those are all things that make us priceless and make us special. That's how I came to this work, and that's how community shows up. If you don't show up, you can't be a part of the movement.
So much. Can the Zoom folks give me a little feedback? Is this mic working okay? Stay here and ask questions. Great, thank you. Oh, it's still cutting out. Okay. I think for our panelists, if you can just make sure to hold the microphone close up to you, that will really help, and I'll try to stay here. But so thank you so much for sharing your story, Maisha. It is so touching and powerful to hear you share that, as well as that you're here with us today. So thank you. So we do want to talk a little bit about what kind of advice we can give to the community now as we are here 1 year later. So I do want to ask Harry first a little bit, if you could share with us a little bit about what advice you'd like to share with the audience around what we can do to honor victims and move forward in the community. I know that you've been very engaged in the AAPI community, so we'd love to hear some of the examples of activities that have been going on.
Sure, and I think the advice that I can give is that hate crime is a complicated issue, and we cannot solve it on our own in just our community. I mean, the best way for us to tackle this issue is to work in partnership and in coalition with other communities, other government agencies, An example would be last year, we are proud to be one of the one of the community organizations that pushed for a bill that passed and became law. And it's a bill to enhance the hate crime statute in Colorado. So that way prosecutors like the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office can, will have an easier time prosecuting this kind of offenses and do not let the offenders get away. We did that in partnership with many people, with both Republicans and Democrats, with both law enforcement and our friends in the Jewish community, our friends in the Black community, our friends in the Muslim community. It was truly a coalition effort. And that is, I think, the best advice I can give is that, please join us in this fight, because we need all of you and all of the allies to be here together.
I think too, Dr. Betts, you also have some examples that you can share with us, how to honor victims.
Yes, and I have one thought about community too, if that's okay. So I think in terms of honoring victims, I appreciate what everyone has said. And I think as we've alluded to, these events and these deaths are complicated and can be, we all probably experience them in different ways based on our own backgrounds and based on the communities that we feel like we're a part of. And I would like to say that I think there are lots of ways to honor victims and to get engaged. You can't do all of it, but some people may turn to their particular community, so AAPI or other communities as defined by race or ethnicity. Some people may turn to their religious communities, some turn to gender issues, and showing up in multiple different ways. And my own work, I do a lot of work around suicide prevention, more around community violence prevention, not because one is more or less important, but just because that's where I felt like I had space to give and work. And so I think the part of the self-care, I think, is acknowledging what feels meaningful and purposeful to you and where you feel like you have skills and talents to provide. I did want to mention one other thing. I think even at the most basic level that people can get involved, I think we need to acknowledge what's happened over the COVID period in terms of a huge surge in firearm sales. There's an estimated 7.5 million Americans who are first-time firearm owners. We don't have great numbers in the AAPI community, which traditionally has had lower prevalence of firearm ownership, but certainly I think pre-COVID, it was about 10% of AAPI individuals in the US were firearm owners compared to about 36% of whites. But certainly there's lots of anecdotal evidence that there's been a surge in the. So there's a huge need for education of those new firearm owners about safe storage at home to prevent kids getting into guns, the risks around domestic violence and suicide when there are firearms at home. And so certainly for anyone who's considering purchasing a firearm or has purchased one, it's incredibly important to take that responsibility very seriously and really make sure that you are educated and equipped to use it in the right way so that no one becomes a part of the club that Maisha.
So much for sharing. You alluded to this, Dr. Betts, I do want to talk a little bit about self-care. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ida and Maisha. So tomorrow is the actual 1-year anniversary. And nationally, we are holding the day to honor the victims. And so want to ask you around, what are some of those self-care activities that we should engage in on difficult days like tomorrow?
It's such an important question. And I think, again, just going back to the Asian American community, Pacific Islander communities, there is also some cultural issues that sometimes makes it difficult to do self-care. There's a feeling about, oh, I feel selfish, or I don't want to bother somebody else, or it's just something that I don't have the time. There are all these reasons that we don't do it, but it's so important because if we don't do self-care, I think whenever we work with the communities, I sort of turn it around just a little bit and say, the best way to take care of your family, to take care of the loved ones, is that you take care of yourself first. So you have the energy, both physical and emotional, to be there for them. It is not selfish at all. In fact, it's the greatest thing that you can do. And we all find self-care in lots of different ways. It could be something as simple as going for a walk, being with people that you really, really like. And particularly on days like this, another thing for self-care, and as we're honoring the victims, and I really first started, it's not just the name. You gave a little bit of something about who that person was. It's that we see each other as people, as human beings, that we also celebrate who we are, because that's part of healing. I am Asian American. I am begin to internalize not the fear, not the shame, but we internalize the pride. And that's a really good way. It's a good way to honor these women. As we not acceptable, we will not. And by healing one at a time and community, when everybody's talked about having allies. Cannot do this alone, but when we recognize it, we do not forget. That's, I think, a huge part of self.
Thank you. I love what Dr. Ida said, and when she says, take time to be around people you like. That's very important. Because I think that's very important as you think about self-care, because we, especially in the work that we do, we're natural servants, we're natural givers. I am a nurse practitioner, and so I spend the majority of my day helping people who I like and love. But on the day that my brother was murdered on June 20th, I really take the time to spend time with people I like, people I love, and then also to check in with my family members, to give out hugs, to receive a hug. Sometimes I'm the person who's always giving, and it's okay. I had to come to the realization that it's okay for me to be a receiver of love, a receiver of time. When Javad passed away and Vivian passed away, I felt like I lost time. And I felt like I had to give every single moment of my day to the cause. And so it's important that we say it's okay to sit, to be still, to enjoy the mountains, to go for a walk, to go to the cemetery. I think it's also important that we, in addition to speaking the names of the survivors tomorrow, it's okay to check in with them, and we appreciate it. It may make me cry and get tearful, but I tell you, for all the survivors I work with across the country, we all appreciate when people put our loved ones on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and they say, I'm thinking of you. I also love I have dogs. I have some really big dogs. I love them. So I also love to cuddle and snuggle with them. But self-care is really what makes you happy. I learned to be very patient as a survivor. Christine, who is my mother, she decided she didn't want to be in the movement. She didn't want to be an advocate and be on TV and go down to the Capitol, run for office. But every year on the anniversary of their death, we go to the Korean spa right here on Havana. And I have enjoyed it, and we get facials and out. And I remember the first time we went, the first year after Javad's death, they started trying to wash my mom's hair. And my mom was like, no, you can't wash my hair. You know, Black people have different kind of hair. And they were pouring this milk in our hair. And at first we were like really nervous about it. Now we needed to go to the hairdresser after we left, but it definitely felt good. And it's a self-care thing that we do every year on their anniversary.
I'd like to open it up to other panelists around what you do for self-care, other ideas you have for the audience.
So since someone just handed me the mic, I guess I'll answer first. You know, as someone who is in law enforcement, like everyone here, actually, as it occurred to me, every single one of these panelists confronts horrible trauma every day. I was talking to Dr. Betts earlier, who mentioned her second job is in the ER. I'm sure she sees a lot of horrible things. Obviously, Ms. Fields has seen personal horrors, Dr. Ida and Harry. And I guess the other thing that we all have in common is that we're all doing something about it. And I will tell you, as a prosecutor, the thing that makes me get up in the morning is the reality that I'm not so arrogant as to think that I'm going to change the world in a day. I don't think any of us do, but I will say the fact we're doing something is what makes it worthwhile. You know, there's that saying, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And that's sort of how I feel. It's like, well, I'm doing something, you know, I'm at least trying. And that is empowering. It's more empowering than sitting back and just thinking about how horrible things are. Whatever action you feel you can take, at whatever level, just do it. And I think that will be empowering for you and educational, and healthy.
And for me, I engage in self-care by spending time with friends, so that way I don't feel so alone and isolated. Because I think when trauma like this happens to our community, sometimes it's natural to feel like you just want to be by yourself. You want to protect yourself, be in your safe house or apartment, and not saying that that's wrong. I mean, everybody deals with this differently. My way is I have to go out and meet people and know that I'm not alone, that there are allies and good people out there.
Thank you. I think just to add to that, I think you're already hearing the sort of real diversity of how people approach self-care. And I think that is in part because we all experience trauma very differently, and we need to normalize that people's reactions are different. And I have learned over a long career in the ER that I need to process, because if you just try to push it down, that doesn't really work. For myself, I've learned actually for about the first 2 hours when I get home from work, I can't talk to anyone. I can't talk to my kids. I'm done. I'm completely drained of empathy. But after about 2 hours, I'm back and I can lean back into it. And after particularly bad cases, I need to process somehow and let myself feel and let myself breathe. Because I think that's how you then get up the next morning, work, and hopefully way to make a difference.
Harry, I want to turn back to you about some of the community activities that have been going on in Colorado. Historically, when you think about the AAPI community, our voices aren't often heard or aren't often at the table. And so you mentioned or alluded to earlier a little bit about a statewide coalition and some of the work of bringing together community-based. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about some of the town halls and the rallies that have been going on, just other opportunities for.
Sure. Yeah. So because we have a small community here in Colorado, we are fortunate in that a lot of the leaders, we do know each other. We have history of working with each other, and we have that trust. So when COVID outbreak happened in 2020, we formed a small coalition of a lot of the direct service organizations, just so that we can rapidly collect resources, apply for funding, pass it along to our community. When the shooting happened in Atlanta, that coalition was, kind of the initial driving force behind a lot of the rally, the healing space, the workshops. It has expanded. So now there is a statewide coalitions that is being formed and to try to tackle other bigger issues. And of course, we always do this in partnership with other organizations as well. We're part of the Hate-Free Colorado Coalition. That's a coalition of law enforcement, Sikh community, Jewish community, Black community to tackle hate crimes. So, I know that those of you who are in attendance in person, there's a QR code passed around with resources. And those of you on Zoom, there's a link being posted. So that's a great way for all of you to find out upcoming events, how you can get involved, and what you can do to support our work.
I do see that there's a question coming up from our Zoom participants. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. So what recommendations do you have for responding to friends and family who may not understand your grief? Since at least for me, a lot of these feelings have risen to the surface over the past year. For example, when they say, I don't know how you cared so much about these type of issues. So would love to ask any of the panelists if you could respond to that question of how do you respond to friends who don't understand you? Looking at Dr. Ida.
I think one of the first things to acknowledge is that we all do have different levels of comfort and awareness around this. And I think it's sort of to be able to acknowledge that, and it's okay to not be really, really clear and to not be upset if somebody comes back to you that way, but to be able to say, can I just look at the, because I was trying to read it sideways here. It says, yeah, we'll bring that one back up because it was a good question. I want to make sure I answered properly. What recommendations do you have for responding to friends and family who may not understand your grief? And it's okay because they may not understand it, but just for you to say, it may be hard for you to understand, but this is a grief that I do feel. It's something that has, and it goes back to what Dr. Betts was saying, it's important for us to be able to process. And what we need to be able to do is be clear that it is okay. And to say, sometimes I get confused myself. I'm not really sure what is going on. This is brand new. And I would like for you to be able to, that we could at least have these conversations because it doesn't heal immediately, to be able to go back and forth, back and forth. But I think we shouldn't expect ourselves to immediately have the right answer or a clean answer. Not sure yourself, that's all right. But just to respect the fact that whatever you're feeling, because oftentimes we either will do this to ourselves or it wasn't that bad. And I want to sort of add on to that. We sometimes, out of kindness, say exactly, oh, it wasn't that bad. Intent is to make them feel better, but instead say something simple as, I'm sorry that it hurts so much. I wish it didn't. But when we say it wasn't that bad, we're just as opposite intent that we have. That's when people go in and they hide.
Thank you so much. There are several more questions coming in via chat, but I do want to turn it first to the audience to see if anyone has a question in the audience, and I'm happy to give you the mic. I know, here. Anyone else have a question from the audience before we go back to the Zoom? Okay, here, can you pass this mic over to him?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Andres from Hickenlooper's office. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. And so I wanted to ask, what can Congress do to tackle this issue? What else can Congress do? Ask some legislation, but I wanted to ask what more can be done here?
So I guess as the lawyer on the panel, I can take this one to start. So the amendment that Harry mentioned, the statutory change we effected in Colorado, added a phrase, just 5 words actually, to the hate crime statute, the bias motivated crime statute, that actually expanded our ability to hold these types of offenders accountable. And that language is in whole or in part. In other words, the old version of the statute essentially said we could only prosecute someone if their motivation was exclusively due to a person's involvement in that protected class, be it race, religion, national origin, et cetera. By adding the phrase in whole or in part, we've expanded our ability to identify certain types of offenders and punish those folks appropriately, because what we see is that very often these sorts of offenses have mixed motives. For example, if someone is intent on committing a robbery, well, their primary motive is robbery, right? That's their goal, but perhaps they target a member of that protected class, that person who is disabled, that person who's LGBTQ, that person who is Asian American, because they are perceived as being an easier target, right? And so we often find these mixed motive type crimes. And so to the extent on the federal level, there's ability to maybe expand that language, I think that would be very valuable.
Brian, did you also want to add in, Dr. Betts?
I do, because given that, especially we're in a setting of higher education right now, I think I'd like to highlight the importance of ongoing research and community programs around understanding why these events happen, how to prevent them, what are effective ways to identify people who are at risk of perpetrating or of being victims, what are ways for intervening with, say, youth who are involved in violence and so forth. It's been wonderful over the past few years to finally see federal funding for firearm-related research, which hopefully will continue. And it's been great to see some of the bigger organizations like the VA and the military start to really lean into some violence prevention programs. But we definitely need more at the community level. Well, and it's not about gun control. It's about understanding how to prevent these heinous crimes, how to support the survivors, and how to support the community organizations that are out there doing the work every day.
That in.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I worked for Hickenlooper for 10 years, and I would say he has the roadmap of what success looks like. I mean, Colorado passed some of the strongest legislation across the country for about 6 years to reform and to create safer communities. And I think the first thing that we need to understand is that the filibuster is killing us. It is the Senate that has not made meaningful action. The Congress has sent over a very strong plan. We can even talk about the Build Back Better Act, which was going to provide $65 billion worth of funding, and $5 billion of that funding was going to go to community intervention programs and victim services. So I think we start there. We start with Hickenlooper being the leader he was here as our governor, and we get him to take charge and to work with our good friends in West Virginia and Maine. And we get something passed, because every day we have the filibuster, people are losing their lives. So thank you for being here.
So thank you for your question. I do want to go to a question that we have on Zoom, and I think this is related to the fact that that the term Asian Americans encompasses so many groups, right? I mean, so many different groups that are engaged in that particular category. And yet we know there's so much diversity and differences just between groups. And so the question that has come up in the Zoom is actually around how can we think about these anti-Asian hate crimes interpreted in the AAPI community under the transnational context? How can we help raise awareness of the challenges of the AAPI community within each subgroup of the broader AAPI community? We know that there are so many differences amongst them. So curious to hear from our panelists what you think about that.
Since I have the mic, I'll make this
Go
brief
right
because I think
ahead.
everybody can respond to this. That's actually sort of a two-part. It's how we deal with this internally and then how the world responds to us, because the world sees us as all the same. And that is a problem. And that is, it bothers, that's the reason why the data is saying that Asian Americans have no problems, because they don't disaggregate the data and look at the great disparities between them. There's a whole list which we won't have time to go into, but it's really, really important to get the second part, and I will pass it on to others. One of the reasons, and it sort of goes back to the question you were having about what Congress can do. Last year, they passed $3 billion to go into mental health, which are really, really pleased. Fortunately, the way that the money comes down through SAMHSA and goes to the state's block grants, our communities, that money does not trickle down. So it gets to the point of, if you've got all this money and they go, this is great, we've just given you $3 billion. We're talking to members of CAPEC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and Barbara Lee was on there from the Black Caucus. They've written a letter to SAMHSA saying, want to know where those dollars went to, how many communities actually received those dollars. And it wasn't as if people were trying to say, oh, well, we don't care. It was just not knowing what the process is, because then that filters down. So that place like APDC that provides direct services are then able to provide services that there isn't such a thing. I actually remember a number of years ago when somebody said, we can do the services. We put in the newspaper looking for somebody who speaks Asian, and we're going, excuse me, I won't say who or what said that, but that just shows. So it's absolutely imperative that as you go upstream to where the dollars are, it filters down. It has to come back to the APDCs of the world, because if we don't look at the disaggregated data, we cannot possibly address in a proper way the needs of very, very unique communities, and they will tell us what happens. It's not that you just hire an interpreter, it's hiring multilingual. So anyway, I took more than 5 seconds, but I'm sure others have responses to that.
Others' responses.
I guess I'll just add my 2 cents, which is, I don't know who said this first, but it's something that's always resonated with me, which is that prejudice is based on ignorance, right? It's fundamentally about, and laziness. It's choosing to categorize people as opposed to actually getting to know people, right? The core of prejudice. And so to the extent each of these individual subgroups that make up the broader sort of Asian American community can do what they can to educate the community, right? It is harder, I think, to be bigoted and prejudiced towards a group once you know a little bit more about that group. And I guess the second part of it is that I think the reason why Asian Americans have become more of a target for crime is because they are perceived as being less unified. They are perceived as being a more vulnerable group as a whole. And that's because, in fact, in a way, they are disunified, right? I remember a trainer came to our office about 12 years ago to talk about Asians. And she posited that, Asians are all passive and Asians don't like the government. And Asians prefer to handle things within their own communities. I was like, okay, what's that community, right? I mean, tell a first generation Korean American whose parents are maybe imprisoned by the Japanese, to go be buddies with a Japanese person, or tell a Pakistani to be friends with an Indian person. There is a degree of sort of distinction within that group. So I do think it's important in organizations like Harry's that sort of try to bring together an umbrella of organizations to work on these things is really valuable. But I also think it comes down to each sort of group or subgroup doing what they can to educate. Bottom line.
I'm going to add to what Dr. Ida said as well. And I'm glad to see that there is more of a movement now to disaggregate data, to not just collect data as Asian, but also by different ethnicity, because each group does have unique challenges, and we have to approach each group with respect to like the history, the culture, the language barrier. Just to give you a recent example, we're still approached to this day by different public health agencies or government agencies that says we need to increase the rate of COVID vaccine among the Asian community. And then I would say, great, which community? We have no idea. I'm like, yeah, I don't know how to help you because this is very different language, different method of communication, different social media. If you don't tell me, I don't know. I have anecdotal evidence, but that's the best anecdotal evidence. I mean, that's all I have. I don't have any hard data.
Thank you. I think that issue of data disaggregation is, when we've done listening sessions with other organizations, state and city, oftentimes they just don't collect that ethnic data. And that's really important because then, Harry, as you said, we just don't know. We don't know. We want to turn to a question that's also up in the Zoom from our audience. Started to allude to it. It's that idea of being the model minority. And recognizing that there are so many differences within the Asian groups that really break down that myth. And so curious to think, this person is asking, do you think existing model minority or perpetual foreigner perceptions may have how mainstream reacts to these Harry, you've got the mic, so you can go first. How do you think that's impacting?
Number one, it absolutely impacts the hate crimes. A lot of the rhetoric around COVID, I think, exacerbate a lot of the hate crimes, calling it China virus, the Wuhan flu. That's when we start noticing a sharp increase in hate crimes against the East Asian community. But it also plays out in other contexts as well. I mean, for example, the recent Olympic, there was a lot of news coverage about the American born China, skier that could decide to compete for China, right? There's a lot of news commentator calling her a traitor. How dare she betray the country, blah, blah, blah. What nobody seems to mention is that there's an entire hockey team of white dudes that's playing for China. And there is not a single article written about how they're traitors to the country. So it still influenced that model minority, perpetual foreigner. And I think that's a big problem we have.
Add very, very briefly, just that I think the perception is that as a large group, Asian Americans are doing better financially than perhaps some other minorities. I'm not sure it's true, but I think that's the perception, and that translates to, well, they're not as in need of help as some others, right? And I think that's sort of a lazy way to look at it. I don't think that the data would necessarily bear that out, but I think that's part of it.
Just to echo what everyone else has said, there is definitely an increase of extremism across the United States of America. And we have seen this take place based on our previous administration, and also the fear and the threat that white men have in America. And when we look at that in parallel data as it relates to white men, we know that the majority of shootings that happen in our country are occurring at the hands of white men who have issues with either past aggression, domestic violence, assaults, substance abuse, and feeling isolated. And with that isolation, there is the threat that certain individuals, certain races of people are achieving the American dream faster than they are, or that they have been denied opportunity at the hands of Asians, immigrants, Latinos, African Americans. And that's why we saw the insurgent on January 6th, right? Where people said, we have to take our America back. And they're doing it with arms. They're doing it with assault weapons. They're coming into spas, into our schools, into their communities with a sense that they're going to take their America back. And so we have to be aware of this. And then we also have to look and identify people that we see are not healthy and that they're not well. And unfortunately, when we look at that data, it is white men, and we have to call it out. We have to call the elephant out that's in the room, and then we have to eat it one bite at a time.
Thank you. Way to tie together. So I'm going to turn us to our final question to the panelists. I know that Dr. Betts has a hard stop on the hour, so I just want to make sure I turn to her first. So this question is a question about a message of hope. So as all of us are residents of Colorado, we've been, many of you and many of us in the audience have ties to gun violence. And so there's also this perception that as Asian Americans that we, as a I can just live with Asian or anti-Asian hate as a So I want to ask you all to answer this question around amidst this darkness, feeling like maybe we might be desensitized to these issues, or that we have a feeling of hopelessness that things won't change. What actually gives you hope? What should give us as a community?
Thanks. So I would say for me, it's reminding myself through daily conversations that most people don't want the division and the extreme that we hear about, that we see in Congress, and that we see on the news. I do a lot of work with firearm owners and firearm retailers around violence prevention issues. And it's hard work because we often have very divergent views and different. I think meeting other people who are from other groups and learning how to communicate and work together towards a common goal is refreshing. And I think, like Brian was saying, there's a lot of, I think, misunderstandings and misperceptions and ignorance out there. And that's where I get hope, is one day at a time, one person at a time, having conversations where you can see your own mental model and theirs really start to shift.
So much, and thank you again for hosting us. Harry, what would you offer?
What gives me hope is seeing the allies we have, how we have allies from both political parties, other ethnic groups, other states, other countries. I mean, you are not alone. There is a lot of leaders working hard every day to tackle this issue. And we certainly welcome any of you to join us in whatever capacity you can. I mean, this is a wide open field.
Sorry.
What I would say is, I think what gives me hope is the amount of progress we've actually made. I mean, I think back to, I'll share a personal story. When I was in high school in North Carolina, I was in a relatively progressive part of the state, but it was still a place where kids with my face and my name were not common. And I'm not saying it was a routine occurrence, but I would be called a Jap or whatever. And that was sort of tolerated. It was the teacher might give someone a disapproving frown if they said that. I look at my kid now, he's an 11th grader in high school. Like, if someone were to use a racial slur against someone in their high school, they get kicked out. I mean, the degree of awareness surrounding those issues has increased so much over the years. I mean, really exponentially, in terms of not tolerating that sort of behavior among young people, even among old people. You know, there wasn't a hate crime statute 20 years ago. You know, it wasn't recognized as being a area of crime that was in need of special attention. Now it is. So the fact that things have in fact gotten better is what gives me hope.
A couple of years ago, I was in a really, really bad mood. So we started this thing called Asians in Focus. Those of you that know me, it's like, so what else is new, DJ? Another bad mood day. But it was to find creative ways of healing. And I was able to surround myself with this incredible group of young women, Asian women, who were just strong of heart, strong of belief, and just conviction. And they got this whole movement going. And we are now in the process, and I would love to have any of you join us to also doing Friends Do Make a Difference. And it's the power of, we're going to be doing mental health leadership training for high school students. And Rochelle's going to be a part, she's a part of this project. And part of it is to help students find a safe way to talk about mental health, understanding that racism is a mental health issue, but also finding joy and pride in who we are is mental health with a capital HELTH, and being able to find creative ways of healing. And just watching these young women who have brought so much, they've given me such energy, and I watch what they bring to the table, and they're representing a whole nother generation. And this gives me profound hope that we can make some real difference.
It was really difficult for me to be hopeful after Javad and Vivian passed away. I was a young mother in California, and I had I think she was like 12. She was just about to be 1 year old. And she was one of the type of children who you have to put in the car and drive her around for 3 hours, get her to go to sleep. And if that didn't work, I would just crawl and get into the crib with her. And so on this particular night, I was in the crib with her, and I got a call from my mother. It's about 2 a.m, and she told me my brother had been murdered. And I'm like trying to get out the crib. The baby's crying. I'm trying to figure out what's next. And I sat on the plane just crying. I know the person next to me was like, what is wrong with this girl? And I got off, and my mom met me at the gate. She worked for United Airlines at that time. And she was distraught. And she said to me, no mother should ever have to bury their child. And from there, we went to the morgue to identify Javad, and Vivian was there with us as well, or Christine, Vivian's mother, was there, so we had to identify her body as well. And I was hopeless. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what our next step should be. And all these people are asking questions, and there's press everywhere, and you really don't have an opportunity to heal, to think, to process. And our pastor showed up, and he prayed with us. And he gave me a scripture that I still hold near and dear to my heart to this day. And so I would say that for me, hope came about by believing that I could make it. Believing that the universe, the Lord, would put people around us to love on us, to encourage us, to help us see beyond the very grim feelings that we were feeling at that time. And my daughter, I felt very isolated. I felt like I had isolated her as well, because I couldn't be the mother that I wanted to be to her because I was dealing with my own grief. But inside of that, the Lord showed me that my children were actually giving me hope. And they would come to me with flowers, and, you know, we had to change birthday parties around for them because we had a funeral, and her birthday was going to be on the date of the funeral. So we had to move that around, and she was so gracious and kind and sacrificial. And I think that in my life, children have really given me hope. Whether it's my own children, or just this past week, I had a chance to go over to British Stanley, a private school that's right over here. And I was with a group of kindergartners, and they were doing a lesson on Martin Luther King and how they wanted to change the world. And without me even saying anything, the children were writing little, prompts. I want people to stop killing people. I want people to stop killing animals. I want us to have a safe place to live and go to school. And they talked to me about their own fears and how they wanted to change the world. And so I find hope and inspiration in children, in our youth. and how they want to make a difference to end the filibuster and maybe become the elected officials that we really so desperately need.
So much. I think often of some advice that a colleague of mine gave me. She shared with me that any decision that is made in the Native community, they make it for the next 9 generations. They think so far forward to recognizing that every decision that they make, we need to think about our future in that way for our kids. So I thank you so much for sharing your messages of hope with everyone in here and on the Zoom. And we still have questions. So I want to make sure that we're having that opportunity for people to ask. And if you could just introduce yourself and share your question, that would be great.
Everyone, hi, my name is Qing Li. I'm an epidemiologist in this room. Honored to learn the pain, the harm, and the solution we may have as a group collectively. My question to you relate to of our community federal funding. All have the needs in our pain and individually, but our tax dollars will be allocated to each of us just based on that grant proposal. Without that grant proposal, other people got money, we would not. So this is the question in general, because I know APDC has been here in 1980s. I was a student in Latinx Research Policy Center. Their professors are CU professors. Their students got certificates serving the community, working on research process or public health projects. So can we recognize these needs and what's our solution? For example, there is federal funding, $2 million, 5 years, which Colorado can apply for to reduce mortality. In this community, from 2014 to 2016, the Asian American ranked the top 2nd in terms of 1.5 times compared to Latinx and African American mothers. The top one was Native American mother, 4.6 times. So there are 8 mothers were died due to homicide. Mother were died due to suicide. That can be due to the. So there's data available. We want to say these aggregate data to learn what's the needs for Asian American mothers. There's data. I want to analyze. We want to submit grant proposal, compete funding to understand what's the reality, how we make change. Thoughts? Yeah.
Who would like to answer?
Sort of a quick answer. We actually are working on something that will hopefully get the funds very, very quickly. Last year, we got Congressman Chu to designate May 10th as National Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Mental Health Day. They're going to present this resolution to Congress every year. One of the reasons for doing this is to make Congress aware of the mental health issues for our communities. So as they appropriate funds will go to communities of color, not just the Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, but all BIPOC communities. And so that's sort of the quick and dirty. As we're going through this, if you contact either Change Matrix or NAPIMA, we'll give you the information. Colorado is only the 2nd state in the country to get this designated. California is the first. Colorado did it last year. We're hoping to get as many states as possible this year. So on this May 10th, we can say to Congress, Chu, not another 20 states or whatever we're going to be able to do. So that's what you can do as you move up past that each state. And then
So I don't purport to understand sort of exactly what your funding mechanisms are through the university. What I can say is that it seems like certain issues take center stage at different points in history, right? And now we are at a point where bias motivated crimes and hate crimes are very much a topic of conversation, which means that the decision makers, i.e. the people holding the purse strings, are probably more receptive to requests for funds that are directly related to that topic, right? My elected district attorney chose to stand up a hate crimes team in my office because of the fact that it was a matter of particular public importance, and his constituents were saying they wanted that, right? Senator Hickenlooper's representative is here because this is an important topic. And like, so I do think it's a moment where, to the extent you can tie funding requests to hate crimes and more broadly, I guess, not necessarily crimes, but issues that affect minority communities, you have a better chance of getting funding, would be what I would say.
Yeah, and with us, generally speaking, when we go after big grants, we always apply as a coalition. I mean, oftentimes our community is too small, but when we partner with other communities of color, then that's where we get the most bang for our buck.
Thank you, panelists. I'll just add one additional insight around funding, which is that there is a recent report put out by Asian Pacific Islanders in philanthropy that showed that only 0.01% of all philanthropic money went to the Asian community. 0.01%, which is appalling. And so to think about how you might contact people in philanthropy to ask them, where are your funds going? Take a look at that and see how they are supporting different. So there is also another question in the chat. This is around, and Brian, this might go to you. With the anti-Asian violence happening, are you seeing many of these incidents resulting from individuals engaging in copycats? And how can we break this cycle?
So let me think. It isn't so much copycats, okay? It's not literally one person seeing a news article or seeing a particular crime and saying, I'm going to do that. I do think it is related to, again, the perception that certain minority groups, not just Asian Americans, are more vulnerable, right? It's kind of like what I was mentioning earlier about mixed motives, right? If someone is intent on taking out their rage or their anger against someone, they're probably going to pick the person they perceive as being more vulnerable, or a member of the group that is perceived as being more vulnerable, whether that person is someone who has a disability or is LGBTQ or Japanese American or Muslim. That's who they're going to target. And so I do think the reason why we're seeing an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes is that, there is the perception that our group is more vulnerable, right? And frankly, in 10 years, it might be a different group, unfortunately. I guess one thing I hate to sound cynical, but if the question isn't whether, if someone is criminally minded and wants to rob or steal or hurt, they'll pick someone. It's just a matter of what group or what individual they target. So I do think it ebbs and flows, but I think that's what's going on now, as opposed to necessarily copycats, if that makes sense.
I'll add to what Brian excellently put in that hate crimes is not new to our community. I mean, there's a long history of hate crimes against our community. I mean, there was the anti-Chinese, race riots happening in the 1800s that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then anti-Japanese during World War II, and then anti-Sikh and anti-Muslim after 9/11. I think the way for us to break the cycle is to recognize that this is not an issue that is unique to our community, that it has a long history, and that we have to stand with each other. We cannot turn on each other, because if we turn on each other, that's when we lose.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's here in our audience and to the people who joined us by Zoom for all of your questions. We really appreciate your engagement in today's session. So looking ahead, just wanted to note that May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It is also Mental Health Awareness Month. As you heard Dr. Ida mention, May 10th is being designated as National Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Mental Health Day. We are busy working in collaboration. As Harry said, we don't do anything alone. We're going to work to designate May 10th is that day in Colorado as well. And we're challenging every state in the United States to do that also. And so we do have information about that on our resources page, which was posted both in the Zoom link as well as for those in the audience, we do have a QR code for you. So please do take a look at those resources related to mental health and gun violence. We invite you to add to that too. If you have something you would like to share, please do share that with us. There's also very many ways for you to stay connected. So please do. We need to stay together as a community. We need allies in this work with us as it's so important. And so there's also a list of AAPI organizations in the resource list that you can take a look at. Part of our challenge has been that oftentimes we just don't know who's out there. And there are very many organizations and people doing important work that we invite you to partner with us on. So you'll also find information on our panelists today if you would like to reach out to any one of them in that resource list. They have graciously provided their email addresses for us and invite your questions and your thoughts. So please do reach out to them. So with that, I'd like to invite you to maybe take a moment to reground ourselves. We've been talking about some really challenging events that have happened and some heinous acts that have hurt people in our community. So I invite you to maybe just slow down your breath a little bit. For those of you who are joining us from Zoom, you just want to ground yourself and start to take some deep and quiet and rhythmic breaths to just settle your body. I want to share with you a poem that was shared with me the day after the Atlanta tragedy that I've been using in many healing circles that I've been hosting in the past year. It's called The Radical Gratitude Spell by Adrienne Marie Brown. Just want to close your eyes, quiet your breath, and listen to the words. You are a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder. In a world which seeks to own your joy and your imagination, you have chosen to be free every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles you went through to get here, but I know you have swum upstream, and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is larger than yourself and your journey, to love the particular container of life that is you. You are enough. Your work is enough. You are needed. Your work is sacred. You are here, and I am grateful. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you for those who have joined us by Zoom to be here with us today. Be safe, be well, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.